What's up, cousins? This video is a practice interview, which is intended not just for Android developers, but junior to intermediate developers on all kinds of platforms. Doesn't really matter whether it's web or mobile. We will start by talking about Android-specific questions, but that is only a small section of the interview. The rest of it will be about concurrency basics, so that includes things like futures or having your application work well even when it's doing complicated long-running tasks in the background. We'll talk a little bit about data structures and algorithms. Really basic stuff, but stuff that pops up in many of the interviews that I've had before. And finally, we'll close it with some important behavioral questions about your ability to work in teams. This is kind of my specialty. Now, the content of this interview actually comes from a live stream where I had a live audience answering the questions. To make this a better viewing experience, what I've done is I've heavily edited that video, and I've removed the long pauses that I had while I was waiting for people to answer the questions live. So there are two ways you can watch this video. If you seriously want to practice your interview skills, pull out a timer or a stopwatch, something like that. After each question, I have added a slide which tells you how much time you have to answer the question, the same amount of time I gave to the live viewers, and you can pause the video until the timer is up. Write your questions down, and in the next video, which will be released soon, we will go over those answers. Now, if you want to just have fun with this video and basically treat it like a trivia game, that's cool too. You can take as much time as you want to answer the questions. Now, finally, these questions are based on a combination of my own experience as a software developer. I've been in this field for over 7 years. Some of these questions have come straight out of an interview, or actually several interviews I had with a big tech company. So, if you like this free content, help your cousin out and consider following me on your preferred social media networks, and consider becoming a channel member for as little as $2.99 to get access to many hours of professional content and courseware from yours truly. So that's it. I hope you enjoy the video, and I hope you learned something. So the main topics that we'll be covering are core Android SDK knowledge. We will be talking about concurrency. We'll be talking about software engineering basics. See if I can type. And then we're going to do something really interesting. This is actually my specialty, but we'll get into that later. Behavioral questions. I'm going to ask you some tough behavioral questions. I'll just write the rules here. So you'll have 2 minutes per question. So I'll ask a question. We have something like 15-ish questions. I'll ask a question. Now, there's a couple different ways you can do this. For those who want like a real sort of interview experience, I'm going to suggest that you pull up a notepad document or something like that and write your answers down. And then you can we'll go over the answers together, and we'll have some more senior and intermediate developers here who can give more perspective on these things. I picked questions which basically range from what I would expect a junior Android developer to know, or like a real junior sort of developer. And then one that's kind of like somewhere between junior and intermediate. And then the last question in each section, apart from the behavioral questions, they're supposed to be more challenging, but again, not anything really ridiculously difficult. I will put the questions in the text on the side. That's probably not something you would normally have happen in any remote interview I've done. Usually you just verbally get asked the question, but I realize there's sometimes some language barriers here, so I will paste the question on the side and then I'll read it out. But the important thing here is none of these questions should require an extraordinarily complicated answer. And because we're doing like a remote thing where you're not coding, let me put it this way. A pseudocode answer, great. A plain language answer that clearly describes the steps or anything that's necessary to know, great. And some of the questions here will be a little bit vague. You don't have to give a super detailed answer. Me as the interview, I'm just trying to figure out, do you have a rough idea about those sorts of things? And so our first section is going to be Android SDK/core knowledge. And so I'm going to take off my teacher hat for a minute, and we're going to get started now. So welcome to the interview, and thank you for joining me. So we're going to start with question 1 in Core Android SDK knowledge, Core Android knowledge. So question number 1 is on lifecycle. When you create an Android activity, what is the one lifecycle function that you must override and implement? So for question number 2, so the introduction here is, suppose that a user has activity A. So when I say activity A, it's just some generic name for some generic activity. Activity foo, for example. Suppose that a user has activity A open and running in the foreground. To be specific, I mean that it is in the started lifecycle state. Now, suppose that a new dialog or another activity, which we will call B, is opened and brought to the foreground. After a brief period of interacting with this dialog, or activity B, could be either case, the user returns to activity A. So the question is, upon returning to the foreground, will activity A's onCreate function or method, for you Java developers, be called? And I expect you to briefly explain your answer. Anyways, we're going to move on to question 3. And this is actually based on a question I was given, believe it or not, in an interview with a big tech company. And I did very well with the answer to this question, because for me it was easy. Question number 3. I can't count, I guess. Suppose you have a large and indeterminate, that means you don't know how big it is, unknown data set. For example, you're writing a social media application and each user class has a collection of friends, which we can think of as a large and indeterminate data set. Would Android's list view class be a good choice for displaying this data set in the user interface? And I expect you to give a fairly detailed but not necessarily long explanation of why you think yay or nay, yes or no. Just to be clear, is basically what I'm saying, is Android's list view class a good choice for a large and indeterminate data set for displaying it? Let's get started with question number 4. Now this is really quite important. So this is a 2-part question, and we'll jump in right away. All right, so part 1. In simple terms and or by describing a specific situation, what is a memory leak? And then part 2, which is directly related, which might be a bit of a hint, why is it especially important to be worried about leaking classes which extend context? Or which implement context, I might say. So it's a 2-part question. I'll give everybody a full 2 minutes. For the juniors, a reminder, this is probably not a question you're going to get. And for some of the intermediates. But it's, I think, in my opinion, quite an important one, depending on what kind of applications you are building. So it's a long one. So I'll give everyone lots of time to parse the question before I start the timer. In Android 8, which I believe is API 26 off the top of my head, and even more so in Android 10 or higher. I think Android 10 is like 29 or 30, but I just don't have a good memory for hyper-specific details. In Android 8, and even more so in Android 10 or higher, Major restrictions have been placed on apps which perform background processing or apps which launch activities from an app which is in an idle state, and that is a technical term there in this case, idle state. Suppose you're building an alarm clock application or an application that handles phone calls, video calls, these sort of time-sensitive operations where you really kind of need to wake the phone up. That's kind of the whole point of the application. So, give an overview, and I don't want an implementation, but a rough idea. Give an overview of the classes from the Android SDK that you would or could use to inform the user of an event like I described, an alarm or a phone call. Now, this solution must work with and be consistent with the goals and limitations on what we can and can't do outside of a running Android process, which is currently in the foreground. So the root of this question we're talking about here is what can you and can't you do from the background, because there are tight restrictions on that these days in more recent Android versions. And let's say you had to like show an alarm clock, fire an alarm clock, or take a phone call or something. What approach would you use? What Android SDK classes would you use? Let's assume we're working strictly with the Android SDK. Okay, and that'll be it. So, for real this time, I sure hope so anyways, that is it for our Android specific section, and we will move straight into the other section. Okay, so the next section we're going to go into is practical concurrency. And we can explain what that is if you have no idea, if you're a junior, but we're going to carry on with our questions. I don't actually need to type that because I'm going to copy paste. So, now we're not going to get super technical here. Me as the interviewer, I want to know, do you have a basic idea and how do you typically approach these things? Let's get started with question number 1. Suppose you are writing an application and some of the things you need to do in that application may take an indeterminate, also known as unknown, length of time to complete. What problems can such indeterminate tasks cause for your users, and by extension, you as a developer? So we'll only give about a minute here, but just before I start the timer, I'm asking, how does this impact your users? You can give a technical answer if you want, and that might count for something, but I'm really focused. Follow the question closely here. What does this do for the people that use your application, and by extension you as the developer? You have 1 minute now. Move into question number 2. Okay, let's move into question number 2. Think of a time in the past when you had some kind of indeterminate task, or if you've never had that happen, maybe just imagine, or maybe you can't answer this question. What tools and approaches did you use to create a solution which preserved or provided a good user experience? So what I am asking here is not for an implementation. I just want to know, how do you normally solve the problem of concurrency with respect to having a good user experience? And I am I would like to hear, because this is a very open-ended question, I would like to hear what concurrency library we'll get into that more later, but what tools and approaches do you typically use? And you don't have to give a super long answer here. We'll give 60 seconds here because, again, you don't have to go into a ton of detail. Okay, so that's your 60 seconds up. Now, I realize in retrospect now this question is almost a bit of a repeat, but let me sort of make it a little more specific. So This is more of a speculative question than a right or wrong answer. And my goal here is to learn about how you think about choosing a tool based on project requirements. What do you actually think about? So this is for some people who have experience with a wider variety of concurrency tools. What do you think about when you're choosing a tool relative to project requirements? So let me be a little more specific here. Size/complexity is a project requirement. We could have a lot of things here. Memory, like APK, memory/APK size. Oh, that was a good voice crack. Stuff like that. What I'm trying to get at here, and I should have done a little bit better job proofreading. How do you decide to use, how do you pick a concurrency tool based on what you see in a particular project? And that answer might be I use the same tool for everything. To be clear, I want to learn about your thought process, not just the tools you use, but how do you select those tools? Okay, we're going to move into some software engineering basics. Let's get started. Now, this one requires a bit of unpacking, and what I'm trying to do here is this question is geared towards someone who might not have actually formally studied software engineering at all, but I'm going to give you an example here, and I want to see what your reasoning skills are. We have a function A, it takes in a string, and it just prints it out. Suppose we also have function B. I will paste the code in a minute. And what I'll do is after I'm done talking, I'll just put them side by side so you can follow along. In fact, let's just, yeah. Okay, so function B is given an array of strings, or just an array, but specifically here we're talking about strings, and a separate target string as a second parameter. If you don't know what I mean by target, you'll see in a minute. Function B searches through the array of strings, and if it finds an array element which matches the target string, it prints that string as well. So we have what we call invariants. So here's a short list of invariants, and don't worry, I'll bring this back down so you can see them side by side. So this is important. Assume there are no repeats in the array. It's an array full of strings. Assume the array is alphabetically sorted, and there is a match to the, assume you're guaranteed that whatever target string you pass in is in the array. So these are invariants, and you need to understand that those are sort of the confines of the question, the use case. So we've got a function. It takes in an array of strings and a target string. We iterate through the array for each. String element is each element in the array. It gets popped out. And then we say if string element matches the target string, then we print it out. So let's get to the actual question. And just to finish off here, in other words, both functions are guaranteed to make a single print statement, no more, no less. Two things. So again, this is a question for someone who might not have formally studied software engineering. So suppose the time it takes for a given function to start and finish, that is when it shows up here and then it returns. Suppose that time is something we call runtime. And pro tip, yeah, it is. So the question is, how do these two functions behave differently in relation to runtime, with respect to runtime? Now, this is not a trick question. If you do know the technical answer, you can give that too, that's fine. I'm testing your basic reasoning skills. So we're now again. So that was our introductory question. We're going to move into something where, um, if you haven't formally studied data structures and algorithms, you can certainly still try and give an answer. But here we're getting into some more specific stuff here. I'm just going to zoom in a little so people can see again. All right. So suppose, hopefully everyone can see that. I'll read it out. Suppose we have a collection which is being loaded from a database, and it has 1 million elements. Suppose that each element in this collection is indexed or ordered by an integer, least to greatest. You may answer this question in plain language or pseudocode, as long as I can clearly see the logical instructions, that is the algorithm which you are using. So the question is, what algorithm apparently, let's just, oh, that's weird. WordPad glitched out there for a minute. What algorithm would you use to locate, find, and return an element in this collection based on an index that is passed in? So just a reminder, this is a collection which is ordered, is indexed, and it's ordered from least to greatest. As for the answer, you can just plain English write like step 1, step 2, step 3. You can write pseudocode. I don't really want an actual code implementation, but that's better than nothing. Okay, I think this is a fun one. This will test again, how you think about solutions and problems and a little bit of your experience. So, question number 3. It is true or false, but I would like you to explain your answer a little bit. So, true or false, you should always use the data structure which takes up the least amount of memory to solve any given problem. Is that statement true or false? Briefly explain your answer. Let me give the preamble first. This is a somewhat vague question, so it's actually okay if you give a pretty general answer, but I would like to know what family of data structure you might prefer to answer this question. But I know some of you are very hyper-specific analytical people, and you might be upset at how vague this question is. Just understand, yeah, it's a little vague, but I'm looking for something. If you had to model a complex network or system, such as roadways for vehicle traffic or train traffic or plane traffic, whatever, or endpoints, that's a technical term, in a computer network, computers, routers, etc., etc., what kind of data structure would you use? So we're talking about modeling any kind of complex network or system. I'm only going to give 60 seconds because I expect a very vague, I expect a simple answer. You don't have to go into details here. And if you know it, you'll know it. So those who had a relative idea did basically give the answer I was looking for. And it's a vague, I wasn't looking for a hyper-specific thing, but some of you even got a little bit more specific, which was cool. Okay, we have our final section, behavioral. Listen carefully. Suppose you are working on a product and you are working under a team leader. This could be a project manager. Probably I'm thinking more of like a senior developer, some kind of team leader. The task for today is to solve a difficult problem, and your team leader at the start of the day in your daily stand-up gives you an approach to solving this problem before you get to working on it. For whatever reason, maybe you have some specialized knowledge, or maybe you're just a fart smucker. Switch the words around. The first letter. it occurs to you that you probably have a more efficient solution to this problem. You're pretty sure. How do you proceed? Okay, time's up. Put your keyboard on the ceiling and we'll get ready for the next question. Suppose that you did end up speaking with this team leader. So this is the same scenario. The team leader listened to your explanation. So they listened to you. You laid out your explanation, your arguments, not like argument as in, angry, but why you think your solution is better. But the team leader didn't discuss the matter further, and they respectfully asked you to simply carry on with the original approach. So this person didn't disrespect you, but they didn't give a reason why. They just said, carry on with the approach I gave you. What do you do? Okay, we have number 3. So this one's really, this is a loaded one, and I am trying to put you all in a difficult situation. I've been put in these situations a lot, and so this will be an interesting one. And it's a little complicated, but we have a new situation, new situation. Okay, you have recently joined a small team of developers. Now, when I say small, we could be talking like 4 to 8 or something like that. Or I don't know, even like 3 to 8, whatever. A small team of developers, and apart from one lead developer, everyone is essentially on the same level. So we don't have a super rigid hierarchy here. There's developers, and then there's one lead developer. A couple weeks into working with this team, you notice that one of the other developers is being a bit disrespectful to you. In fact, even though this person has been with the team longer than anyone else, you don't get the feeling that they're actually good at their job. Certainly, they're not really better than you. Now, they cut you off and disregard your suggestions when you bring things up and talk about ideas. As they say, they're throwing a bit of shade. Disrespect. And when you ask this person for constructive feedback, all you get is more disrespect. You ask them, what did I do wrong? Oh, it's okay. You wouldn't understand it anyways. Except for the lead developer, who has a separate office, so the lead developer isn't necessarily there the whole time, and they're not necessarily seeing what's going on as it's happening. And that's an important point. Except for the lead developer has a separate office, the other developers clearly notice what's going on because it's pretty obvious, but they don't intervene or seem to be talking to you about what's going on. They kind of just, don't really pay attention. They might not respect this person a whole lot either, but, everyone else just kind of gets on with their job. How do you proceed? Oi, blin, it is cold in here. I think that's a full 3 minutes, and that will be it for our interview. Congratulations, and thank you for everyone who participated. Seeing some funny answers. Now we will go over the answers